Insanity, the Idea and Its Consequences, by Thomas Szasz. What a thing means is simply what habits it involves. There is no distinction of meaning so fine as to consist in anything but a possible difference of practice. Charles S. Peirce. While the consequences of the thesis I argue in this book are complex, its crux is simple. Absent an agreement on an unambiguous definition of the concept of bodily illness, the concept of mental illness is an empty vessel. Since the 19th century, when medical science embraced the definition of disease as bodily lesion, the main object of medical research has been to identify pathology as etiology. Ignaz Semmelweis's demonstration of iatrogenic contagion as the cause of puerperal fever is a classic example. Lacking a demonstrable basis in somatic pathology, psychiatrists have long viewed mental illnesses as brain diseases whose nature remained to be elucidated. The discovery that general paralysis of the insane is a late sequela of syphilis exemplified and seemingly justified this premise. The continuing search for and current claims about the anatomic, infectious, genetic, and neurochemical bases of mental diseases reflect the same assumption. The somatopathological criterion of disease constrains people and politicians in ways they do not want to be constrained. If demonstrable bodily lesion is the sole criterion of disease, individuals who feel sick cannot define themselves as having a disease, nor can the state define certain behaviors as diseases. To be sure, drinking or smoking can cause disease, but the behavior itself is not a disease. For these and other reasons, people reject the discipline of a medical gold standard. Instead, they opt for fiat maladies, declaring that certain unwanted behaviors, stamped as medical diagnoses, are diseases. Adherence to this convention is supported by peer pressure and is enforced by the power of the medical profession and the state. So long as people accept fiat money, it is valued currency. However, when they reject it, for example, the German mark after World War I, it ceases to be real money. Similarly, so long as people accept fiat malady, it is a valid disease. However, when they reject it, for example, homosexuality in our time, it ceases to be a real disease. If mental illnesses are brain diseases, then they are diseases of the body, not of the mind. In which case, psychiatrists would have to conduct themselves like other physicians, that is, inform the patient of their findings and recommendations, and then wait until he consents to or rejects further diagnostic or therapeutic interventions. Such limitation of the psychiatrist's power would render psychiatry, as we know it, useless. This is why the well-being of the mental health professions and of the society they serve requires conflating and confusing disease and diagnosis, dis-ease and disability, illness and incompetence, lesion and lawlessness, and much else besides. Dwelling on the bodily basis of mental diseases implies that medicine and psychiatry are fundamentally similar enterprises. Indeed, psychiatry is defined as a medical specialty. This is misleading. The history of modern medicine begins with Rudolf Virchow's definition of disease as somatic pathology, whereas the history of modern psychiatry begins with declaring certain persons insane and incarcerating them in madhouses. In short, the insanity defense and civil commitment came first, classifying certain patterns of misbehaviors as diseases to justify excusing and coercing the actors as medical interventions came later. Because the birth of modern psychiatry antedates Virchow by some 200 years, its principles and practices could not be based and are not based on the definition of disease as bodily lesion. Physicians detect, diagnose somatopathology, medical disease, for example, anemia, by examining bodies. Psychiatrists detect, diagnose psychopathology, mental disease, for example, schizophrenia, by examining persons. No mental illness can be detected by examining only the patient's body. As medical science and technology advance, diagnosing medical diseases becomes more accurate, treating medical illnesses more effective, and delivering medical goods and services more costly. Prior to the present century, consumers or their relatives paid for medical services, or if they could not afford to pay, received medical care as a charity or went without it. Today, in contrast, people and politicians alike regard relief from disease as an integral part of the state's obligation to its citizens. These circumstances, each reinforcing the other, render the struggle over the definition of disease and disability of the utmost practical, political, economic consequence. Delinked from the constraints of somatic pathology, defining misbehaviors as mental diseases and hence compensable disabilities becomes a tactic immensely useful not only for would-be patients, but also for relatives, employers, teachers, politicians, and nearly everyone else. As our society constructs and legitimizes more mental diseases, such as attention deficit disorder and false memory syndrome, more people are diagnosed as sick, and the escalating number of disabled Americans is then interpreted as proof of the prevalence of mental illnesses. Thomas, Syracuse, New York, September 1996. Preface to the original edition. Ideas Have Consequences. Richard Weaver. Before we can even begin to try to understand what causes a baffling and troubling phenomenon, or how we might change or remedy it, we must be sure of what it is. In other words, that we have correctly identified its indispensable features. John Selden, a 17th century English jurist and scholar, wisely warned that the reason of a thing is not to be inquired after till you are sure the thing itself be so. We commonly are at, what's the reason of it, before we are sure of the thing. No truer words could be spoken about psychiatry and its core concept, mental illness. What is, in Selden's words, the thing itself that psychiatrists describe, debate, diagnose, and treat? The psychiatrist says it is mental illness, which, he now quickly adds, is the name of neurochemical lesions of the brain. I say it is conflict and coercion and the rules that regulate the psychiatrist's powers and privileges and the patient's rights and responsibilities. The former perspective leads to an analysis of psychiatry in terms of illness and treatment, medical theory and therapeutic practice, while the latter perspective leads to an analysis in terms of coercion and contract, the exercise of power and the efforts to limit it. In short, political theory and legal practice. Accordingly, my aim in this book is to present a critical exposition of the idea of mental illness and its consequences. I do so first by situating it in relation to the closely related ideas of bodily illness, the patient role, and crime. Second, by exploring the connections among the ideas of mental illness, imitation, intention, and responsibility. And third, by articulating the practical uses of the idea of mental illness, especially as a rhetorical device for interpersonal control and social policy, and as an essential element in contemporary explanations of human behavior. Actually, anyone, even a person quite unfamiliar with psychiatry, could reason that a disease characterized as mental must be something other than a bodily disease. A moment's reflection about the way we use our language reveals the metaphoric nature of the mind. For example, we say that we have blood in our veins and ideas in our minds, but we know that the latter expression is only a figure of speech. Similarly, when an assailant shoots someone, the victim may suffer a gunshot wound of the brain, but not of the mind. In short, the term mind refers to an abstract idea and not to an actual object. Although this distinction between the concrete and the abstract, the objective and the fictional, is obvious to everyone when the body anatomic is contrasted with the body politic, it mystifies nearly everyone when an illness anatomic is contrasted with an illness politic, a term by which I mean any personal and social problem now called a mental disease. I want to add a few words here about what this book is not. It is not about the value of psychiatry in general or of any psychiatric intervention in particular. If we view mental illnesses and psychiatric interventions as socially constructed and culturally sanctioned ideas and institutions, similar to Christianity or communism, prohibition or the war on drugs, then it is superfluous to find value in them. Were such ideas and institutions devoid of values, they would not come into being and would not become important. I have discussed elsewhere the help or harm which depends on our values that may accrue to a person from mental hospitalization, neuroleptic drugs, psychoanalysis, and so forth. Here I want to concentrate on locating, clearly and precisely, the conceptual realm into which mental illness and the entire psychiatric enterprise belong, and the practical consequences to which they give rise. Once this is clear, evaluating the helpfulness or harmfulness of various psychiatric ideas and interventions is a relatively simple matter that anyone with a modicum of intelligence and information can undertake for himself. The problem with psychiatry, it is sometimes said, especially by those critical of it, is that psychiatrists have too much power. True enough, but where does this power come from? It does not come from the barrel of a gun held by an oppressor. Instead, it comes from the beliefs of human beings who prefer to rely on mystifying symbols and paternalistic authorities rather than on themselves. Thus, only when people withdraw their blind faith in mental health and mental illness will they see fit to curb the powers of psychiatry, just as only when they withdrew their blind faith in God and the devil did they see fit to curb the powers of priestcraft. Finally, a brief caveat. In this book, I use the masculine pronoun to refer to both men and women, and the terms psychiatrist and patient to refer to all mental health professionals and their clients. I do so because I believe there are more effective ways of advancing the dignity and liberty of women, non-medical professionals, and psychiatric patients than by the now fashionable flaunting of linguistic deformations. Thomas Szasz, Syracuse, New York, September 1986. Introduction. Men have an all but incurable propensity to try to prejudge all the great questions which interest them by stamping their prejudices upon their language. Sir James Fitzjames Stephen, 1873. Virtually all books on mental illness and psychiatry are about what goes on in the heads of either mental patients or psychiatrists. In the former class fall the tragedies written by former patients, novelists, philosophers, and some mental health professionals about what they, the sufferers, or those who sympathize with them, think is going on in the minds of the mentally ill. These are called the inner experiences of the insane and the torments inflicted on them by others. In the latter class fall the comedies written by psychiatrists, psychoanalysts, and other professionals about what they, the scientists and therapists, eager to understand and help the helpless, think is going on in the minds of mental patients and what ought to be done about it. These are called the scientific theories and therapeutic techniques of psychiatry. Clearly, a person interested in mental illness and psychiatry needs to be familiar with both of these kinds of plays and the theaters in which they are performed. But for the real action, he must look elsewhere. What this book is about. The subjective experiences of the mental patient and the theories and therapies of the psychiatrist are like the covers of a book. The front cover, that first attracts our attention, is what the mental patient says and does. Next, we usually examine the back cover, namely what the psychiatrist says about the patient and does with him or to him. Often people go no further, satisfied that they can judge a book by its cover or covers. I believe something like this has happened with mental illness and psychiatry, especially during the past half-century, as more and more books have been written on this subject. The figures of the mental patient and the psychiatrist have become illuminated ever more brightly, casting the stage on which they perform, not to mention the activities going on backstage, in increasingly impenetrable darkness. Insanity, mental illness, or religious symbol. Thus, the scene I want to illuminate is not located inside the heads of the mental patient or the psychiatrist, but outside, in the real world, in the beliefs and behavior of ordinary men and women. Instead of viewing the mental patient and the psychiatrist as the stars of the show, as they invariably are viewed, I shall treat them as actors who merely play supporting roles. The star, indeed the superstar, is an idea called insanity or mental illness. I shall focus on the ways this idea shapes the behavior of family members toward one another, of politicians and legislators toward the citizen, of judge and lawyer toward the criminal, of journalist and writer toward his subject, and in the end, of every one of us toward everyone else. Like religious symbols in the age of faith, in the age of madness, psychiatric symbols are so richly meaningful that they cast their shadows on virtually every aspect of our lives. Accordingly, I have chosen to examine our principal psychiatric symbol, mental illness, from different angles, necessitating some repetition, but at the same time, permitting me to so organize the material that each chapter can almost stand by itself and can be read independently from the others. The character and complexity of the psychiatric enterprise and the relatively subordinate positions of the mental patient and the psychiatrist in it suggest another metaphor for it, namely music. The psychiatric ideology is like a musical score. The institutions of psychiatry, like symphony orchestras, the patients and psychiatrists, like the musical performers, judges and lawyers, like the conductors who direct them, politicians and psychiatric theorists, like the composers who provide the score for them, and intellectuals, opinion makers, and the general public, like enthusiastic audiences clamoring for more and better orchestral scores and symphonic performances. Of course, this in no way excuses psychiatrists from responsibility for the evil they do, just as it does not diminish the credit due them for the good they do. It does, however, put the male factions of the psychiatrist in context, and thus points the finger at those who share his guilt. Mental illness, fact or fiction. Although insanity is, without doubt, one of the most important modern ideas, the Dictionary of the History of Ideas has no entry for it or for any of its synonyms, such as madness, mental illness, psychiatric illness, or psychosis. This remarkable omission points to an important phenomenon, namely that insanity is now considered to be a fact, not an idea. By fact one means simply something like, say, cancer of the colon. That human beings have bowels is a fact. That bowels can become cancerous is also a fact. Today, everyone, including jurists and politicians, physicians and scientists, takes it for granted that just as bodily illness is an objectively definable and identifiable condition, so too is mental illness. As experts in mental health constantly remind us, mental illness is like any other illness. Moreover, the view that mental illness is not an idea, but an illness, a fact, is supported by the very existence of the governmental agency called the National Institute of Mental Health, an institution similar in name as well as ostensible purpose to the National Institutes of Arthritis, Cancer, and Neurological Diseases. Arthritis, cancer, and neurological diseases are, of course, illnesses, not ideas. The proposition that the term mental illness names a bona fide illness is also supported by the American Psychiatric Association, APA. The authors of the association's official Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM-3, emphasize that, actually what are being classified in the manual are disorders that individuals have, emphasis added. In an obvious effort to underscore the factual material existence of mental illnesses, the authors add, the text of DSM-IL avoids the use of such phrases as a schizophrenic or an alcoholic, and instead uses the more accurate but admittedly more wordy an individual with schizophrenia, or an individual with alcohol dependence. By capitalizing the names of mental diseases, the APA evidently hopes to dispel any lingering doubt that these names refer to something other than real diseases. At the same time, it is obvious that in contemporary American speech and writing, the words illness and health, especially in their adjectival forms, have a dual reference to bodily disease or its absence on the one hand, and to good and bad behavior on the other hand. As a result, terms such as healthy and sane now do the job that words of praise did in the past, and terms such as sick and insane do the job that words of condemnation did in the past. What, writes a perplexed person to Ann Landers, can a woman do with a husband who refuses to live within his income? He brags to everyone that he is going to buy his daughter a car for graduation when our car isn't paid for yet. Ann Landers' reply, your husband is a compulsive buyer, which is a sickness. There is, let us make no mistake about it, nothing humorous or metaphorical in Miss Landers' diagnosis. She knows, and her readers know, that this man is mentally ill. If then nearly everyone believes or does not bother to doubt that mental illness is a fact, how does an author who regards mental illness as only an idea, albeit a very important one, describe and discuss it? Every use of the questionable term only reinforces the seeming reality of its existence. There are ways around this problem, of course, as the following familiar example illustrates. Consider these three different phrasings, any of which might have appeared in an American newspaper or magazine article after Pearl Harbor. 1. Because of the danger Japanese Americans pose. 2. Because of the alleged danger Japanese Americans pose. 3. Because of the danger so-called Japanese Americans pose. The first phrasing implies that the writer accepts the proposition that Japanese Americans pose a danger. The second questions that they pose a danger. The third questions both the reality of the danger and the legitimacy of classifying certain Americans as Japanese Americans. Because I question and reject many conventional psychiatric ideas and interventions, but want to use conventional language to communicate my ideas, there is a temptation to qualify certain commonly used words, such as mental illness, schizophrenia, mental hospital, mental patient, and so forth, by inserting alleged or so-called before them, or by putting the word between quotation marks. In order not to clutter the text with such disclaimers, I have resisted this temptation. The context, together with my general position on psychiatric matters, should make my meaning clear. An author who wants to describe and discuss something that nearly everyone accepts as a fact, but which he views merely as an idea, has some other problems to contend with as well. For example, how does he arouse and hold the interest of the general reader who knows that mental illness is an illness like any other? Or of the psychiatrist who has a vested interest, existentially as well as economically, in mental illness qua illness? The former has no need for a different perspective on mental illness, while the latter can ill afford one. Truth and the state. I feel content in the belief that, as Thomas Jefferson put it, it is error alone which needs the support of the government. Truth can stand by itself. Since, except for national defense, there is nothing that our government now supports more vigorously than health, especially mental health, anyone who values the truth ought to think twice before embracing the flood of information about mental illness that carries our government's imprimatur. I am convinced that psychiatric explanations and interventions are fatally flawed, and that deep in their hearts, most people think so too. The evidence for this abounds. If mental illness is common, can strike anyone, and is just like any other illness, as the experts claim, then why do people hardly ever think that they themselves have such an illness? Why are they not more afraid that they will get such an illness? And why, if they themselves are so wonderfully free of mental illness, do they find others so terribly full of it? In all these ways, mental illness resembles the scriptural beam in our own eyes and the mote in our brothers much more closely than it does diabetes or cancer. Mark Twain was right when he observed that nothing so needs reforming as other people's habits. While distressing behavior is real enough, and while it is possible to describe it more or less accurately, neither that reality nor its mapping has much to do with mental illness or psychiatry. Why this is so, I shall try to clarify in the pages that follow. Another problem I have had to resolve concerns presenting examples of mental illness or so-called case material. Since I do not believe in mental illness, I can present examples only of persons whom others have diagnosed as or called mentally ill. Accordingly, I cite many examples of mental illness and of acts committed by mental patients, culled for the most part from stories in magazines and newspapers. This not only allows both author and reader the same access to the same material, it also protects the reader from being gulled by distorted, contrived, or fabricated accounts of dramatic mental diseases and psychiatric cures.